All right. We'll go ahead and get started. Looking forward to a great session today. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us on our Learning Exchange series. We will have a great talk today. We have really exciting presentation. We're right in the middle of our speaker series here. So just again, welcome everyone. My name is Lauren Cooper. I am the host today from the Forest Carbon and Climate Program. And again, we're right in the middle of our 2021-2022 Learning Exchange series. And we're really pleased to lead this Learning Exchange series in partnership with the Forest Climate Working Group. For those that aren't familiar, this group is a diverse group of actors with very diverse forest interests, has over 60 members, 60 member organizations, I should say, that include landowners, industry actors, conservation NGOs, academia, and those active with carbon markets. And the group has worked together for more than a decade to advocate for state and federal policies that work to ensure sustainable forest use and prevention of land use change. And so this series is part of the knowledge management efforts of this group. As you can see here, we have the full year's lineup. And so if you have not signed up for future events, please feel free to do so. You can sign up for any of them now on our website. We can drop a link in the chat. So you can, if there's upcoming topics that are of interest to you, please feel free to sign up so that they're on your calendar. Also note that we have quite a resource of previous recordings and PowerPoint slides and links to external resources that are all on our website from past talks this session and also from previous sessions. So please consider that a resource and go and check that out if you see a talk there that was interesting to you that you missed. But to get to today's speaker, I'm very excited to introduce my friend and fellow Michigander, Chris Swanston, who is the Director of the Office of Sustainability and Climate at the USDA US Forest Service. He is going to be speaking today about climate-informed forestry and USDA Forest Service priorities in this space. So I'll hand it over to Chris in just a moment. I wanted to, I also wanted to reiterate that this is the second presentation in the middle set of our webinars that have themes. Thank you. It's a little small to see here, but you can see on our website that we have three major thematic bins: voluntary carbon markets, changing landscapes of climate and forests, and then emerging science. And so this talk is in this changing landscapes of climate and forests. So we'll be hearing about USDA priorities, how these are embracing climate-informed activities, and also learn about some best practices that Chris has been working on for a long time. So before I hand it over to Chris, a couple of housekeeping details here. One note is please feel free to put in questions at any point. So, and if there's a clarifying question or you want to check some understanding of a phrase or terminology, please feel free to put those in. We probably won't interrupt, but in case there's some important clarifications, we will make sure that everyone's on the same page with some key concepts if that's needed. But we will take your questions and your comments at any point again and kind of organize them. And so that will help us prepare for the discussion at the end. So again, please feel free to put in questions at any point, and then we'll have a nice discussion where we can explore a little bit more with Chris at the end. If you're interested in learning more about webinars and any of our activities, please email forestc@msu.edu to join our email list. And if you are joining by phone, which I don't see anybody today, you can also submit a question at the email and we can add it to the list. And again, you can use the Q&A or the chat for this. Before I hand it over as well, this session has been approved for those that are affiliated with Society of American Foresters for one continuing education credit. If you used your email address that's associated with your SAF membership, that will be communicated automatically for you. But if you'd like to, if you have any questions about that, please feel free to reach out at forestc@msu.edu and we'll make sure that we convey that information. So with that introduction, I'm again delighted to hand it over to Dr. Chris Swanston, and I'll hand it to you, Chris. Take it away. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Lauren, and thanks to the FCCP and the Forest Climate Working Group for the invitation. Let me do the big electronic handover here We'll see if this works. All right, we're almost there. And there we go. Are we good?
Looks great.
Thank you. Okay, thanks folks for joining in. My name is Chris Swanston, Forest Service Climate Advisor. I'm going to talk about climate-informed forestry and some Forest Service priorities today. And you may notice that I am using the term climate-informed, whereas most folks in the government these days, you're going to hear using the term climate-smart. I also use that term. It's a good term. One of my favorites, use it all the time. Climate-smart, I think, can sometimes, if you're saying it to, say, two folks who have different values, can mean two different things. They can have different expectations of your intentions and your actions. It can, in fact, create a maybe a false assumption of agreement. When I say climate informed, it begs the question, well, yeah, it's climate informed, but what are you going to do? And is that climate smart? I want those questions. Those are good questions. We should all be asking those questions. So let me jump into this. First of all, climate change is a threat multiplier. If you look at all of those threats on the left, the Forest Service has been working with these for many years. Most of these for many years, has programs, projects, people, research associated with them. The issue, of course, is that climate change amplifies all of these. And it, in a lot of ways, and of course, generates interactions which themselves amplify issues even more in ways that just basically overwhelm our traditional approaches to a lot of these threats. And so this generates the need for some shifts in approach. And of course, we call those adaptation. And so I use this simple, very simple definition for adaptation, and note that it can be really applied to both institutions and ecosystems. And in that sentence below there about adaptation actions, note the term intentionally. I have a broad view of adaptation actions. They don't need to be radically different than what's been done in the past, or maybe at all different, but they should be intentional. They should be thinking actively about climate change and the way that we're going to address it. And then notice that bottom phrase there, in order to meet goals and objectives. So our goals and objectives in our forests, they're about water, recreation, they're about wood products, access, they're about aesthetics, spirituality. They are about all kinds of things. They are seldom, if ever, about climate. Goals and objectives are about the things that people value in ecosystems. People don't value climate change. Climate change is something to be adapted to. So as we're thinking about that adaptation, we're not throwing out the last 117 years, by the way, happy birthday, Forest Service, not throwing out the last 117 years of sustainable management and conservation, restoration, and all of the concepts and approaches and practices that we've learned as we've addressed those. We're building on them. We're growing them. We're applying them maybe a little differently than we've done so in the past. And so one thing, though, that I want to point out is that as we apply these things, these, in some ways traditions, business as usual, to climate and think about adaptation, underlying every adaptation discussion that we have is a discussion about what we value and our perception of risk and our risk tolerance. And I think that sometimes when we don't acknowledge those things explicitly, or we're not even aware those conversations are happening below the surface, we talk past each other and we get in a bit of trouble. So as we're thinking about a range of values that we have in our forests nationally, we understand that there's different forests that you find in the, say, the Northwest or the Southwest or the North Woods, Southeast. Well, those forests exist because the climate is different there in those places. The climate is changing differently in each of those places. It's going to be and will continue to be impacting the forests differently. Already, we have people who live in those places and interact with the forest. They interact differently in many cases and have different values and value the forest differently. So then on top of all of that, this is actually an ownership map. You see that the ownership patterns are really different as we look across the country. And this creates yet another layer of complexity on everything else I just mentioned. So that as we're thinking about, say, National Forest Service priorities and policies, ultimately, they play out really differently across the country at the level that people work at and recreate at and invest at. And we need to stay conscious of that and ensure that as we're progressing in climate adaptation, we are discussing what that adaptation means, as well as what climate change means for the places we care about. Some of you have seen these slides before. If you've seen me talk, you've seen NIACS, people from the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science talk. I'm going to dig into them still, maybe take them from a slightly different angle this time. So bear with me here. So adaptation options, I think it's useful to be specific about what we're thinking. Now, ideally, we are engaging in activities that are robust across a range of potential future climates and the conditions that they engender. But this is where we get into a little bit of trouble sometimes with climate smart. We don't always have the ability or the capacity or the mandate to engage in activities that people might call climate smart. That might not even be something we're allowed to do. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be actively discussing our values and the risk that we're incurring with the actions that we are taking. Thus, using words and terms, concepts that are explicit. So if we dig into resistance, often we're looking at these high value systems. We might be looking at a system that is a habitat for a threatened or endangered species. Perhaps it's a vulnerable system, vulnerable to climate change. Perhaps we see projections that indicate this system is going to fail eventually. And the climate smart thing to do may be to, hey, replace the system, grow a bunch of carbon, accruing trees, and increase our carbon density and just move on. Well, maybe that's not appropriate. In fact, I think that people who care about these endangered species will say that's not appropriate. And certainly the laws and authorities which the Forest Service works under would not allow a ready adoption of that ecosystem shift. So, what is climate smart versus what is a resistance strategy that is climate informed? And how do we engage in an explicit discussion about our choices? And including how our choices may, again, engender risk. If we think about how we may want to keep that system as unchanged as we can, perhaps to protect a species that we want to protect, we need to understand that as climate continues to change, the more that climate changes, the more it will place pressure upon the ecosystem to change. That means we will need to invest increasing amounts of time, effort, money to maintain that system, all the while incurring ever greater risk of system failure, right? It doesn't mean that that's a bad thing to do or the wrong thing to do. It could be in this situation, there are multiple right things to do, or perhaps no best thing to do. It could just be what we have to do, and ideally we're communicating that. Resilience, a comfort word, comfort concept, often the very best approach, certainly in the near term. I don't need to dig into this too much because it's all where we go to automatically in general. When I use the term resilience, I'm generally using the definition created by Halling in '73, referring to the system's ability to withstand a disturbance, whether chronic or punctuated, and come back to some basic range of characteristics that it started with. Now, even as we're thinking about that idea of more flexibility in a system, given a bunch of options and strategies and approaches that we're taking to help it be resilient, we are still looking at persistence, that we are wanting the system to persist through time. Like resistance, then, the more that climate changes, the more it will pressure the ecosystem to change. Ultimately, the more resources we'll need to invest and the higher risk we're going to incur. Finally, with transition, this idea again is we may view this system as exceptionally vulnerable. It may have already sustained an impact it can't recover from. We may be looking at valuing a replacement system essentially as being of greater value, and we may be willing then to see this shift. Or some of us may, and others may not. This may challenge some of our views of the precautionary principle. This may challenge some of our long-held traditions and love of place and the way a place should look and function. And so nothing about transition is easy. Likewise, as we're thinking about transition through time, oftentimes there's a lot more near-term risk in beginning a transition of a system from what is perhaps vulnerable to what may be less vulnerable or more resilient in the future. So in the future, there may be less need for increased investment. There may be less risk, but in the near term, we may incur risk. We may be planting a species of tree or a variety of a species that's already there that may be beautifully suited to a future 50 years from now, but less suited to what we've got right now. And so we may get dieback, or failure early on before things are able to establish. So I've gone through these. You've heard me again and again basically approach these from a perspective of risk. And I think that that is a valuable way to approach it because risk is really grounded in what we value and why we value things. Likewise, it's important to understand that some of these are really about persistence and others about change. That's okay. I'm not getting into right and wrong here. I just think it's important to talk about, again, what we value and what we intend through our actions. Now, when we get back into this idea of climate smart, oftentimes when people are using this term, they're really thinking about carbon. And so sometimes they're only thinking about carbon. And so when we talk about carbon, we're talking about, and sequestration, as people often say, we're talking about increasing sometimes our carbon inputs, so increasing our uptake of carbon, reducing our carbon losses, so minimizing loss from storage, maximizing storage, and then also sometimes moving carbon into wood products or other forest products, also another form of storage. So what I'll say is that it is critical to understand that if the forest is vulnerable, the carbon in the forest is vulnerable. So now people might quibble about how much of that carbon is vulnerable. That's good. I respect that. I'm a scientist. I quibble, and I love people who quibble. That said, as a fundamental principle, it's just a given. If the forest is vulnerable, the carbon in the forest is vulnerable. What we've been seeing in the last decade or so is that more of the carbon is vulnerable in many forests, especially when we've seen forests out west get impacted by a combination of bugs and fire, than has been vulnerable in the past, historically, what we've expected. So when we're thinking about climate smart forestry, when we're thinking about carbon, we very much need to be thinking about carbon in the context of adaptation, that resistance, resilience, and transition set of approaches and options. To dig in a little bit into that idea of reducing carbon losses as we're thinking about fire, one aspect here is that it may take some loss of carbon from an ecosystem in the near term to ensure greater carbon stability in the long term. That is, fewer losses of carbon from the forest through fire in the long term. And so this isn't necessarily a intuitive approach to some people, but it's an ecologically sound approach. Likewise, we may lose carbon in ecosystems because of gradual decline given gradual habitat shift, leaving trees behind that don't just die right off the bat, but are less suitable for the place now where they're growing and are more susceptible to loss of productivity, to stress, for example. So as we engage with those forests, as we manage those forests, we should be thinking about that, and we should be thinking how we can support greater health and productivity in those forests to decrease carbon losses from them. And a big piece also of coming back from carbon loss, given a chronic or punctuated disturbance, is to, as soon as we can, get in and treat the site if need be, but certainly be planting just as soon as we can. Because if we're thinking about carbon, we want to get as many trees as viable and appropriate on the site, taking up carbon and storing them as we can, as soon as we can. And then finally, that idea about wood products. If we're thinking about carbon across the forest sector and not just in our trees and plants and soils, we really do need to be thinking about wood products, carbon and wood products. And this has two aspects to it, really. One is that there's any number of carbon products, especially some of the newer products like mass timber, that can take a whole variety of wood that we hadn't previously been thinking of as long-lived, and instead integrate that wood, those wood products, into long-lived products. Likewise, this stuff doesn't happen on its own. The forest will certainly adapt autonomously if we don't interact with them. That doesn't mean that the values that we hold in those forests will be maintained. I think that we are genuinely a part of this. We certainly have created climate change, and we should be a part of helping create effectively a soft landing for these ecosystems. That means that we need to be engaging, intervening, managing these forests, and the healthier our forest industries are, the more likely we are able to do that, and do that again in an intentional, informed manner in which we're all discussing outcomes. Finally, on this topic, boy, I could discuss, I love carbon. I'm a carbon guy. I've been doing carbon forever. I could just discuss this all day long. But what I want to focus on are the two little bars actually developed, are urban forests, right? Not a lot of carbon in the urban forests, but there's a couple of things going on that I want to highlight there. And one of them is that while it's not a lot of carbon, those trees have other functions in an urban forest and in our street trees. Namely, they can help us use less fossil fuel by reducing energy usage in buildings in all sorts of ways. Another is quality of life. We live in these places. Most of us live in these urban and exurban zones where we have urban forests and street trees. And there's a real issue of environmental justice and tree equity that we need to be conscious of and constantly talking about. It is important to invest in these areas, sometimes where you may not get as much carbon for your investment, but you improve the quality of life for people. And frankly, that's the right thing to do. Okay, let me adjust a little bit and talk about Forest Service priorities, having gone through some of these core ideas. So guidance, action, and reporting. I'm going to address these 5 topic areas here that you see on the screen. The first one, Executive Order 14008, tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. This basically dominates my life these days. Now, the EO 14008 generated this list of activities and products that you see there. The first, of course, climate smart agriculture and forestry strategy. That's the one there on the upper right. That in turn generated the creation of the USDA's adaptation plan on the lower left. If you squint and lean a little bit in towards your monitor, you can see trees in that picture on the horizon. Not that I have an attitude about the pictures USDA chooses, just saying. And then, of course, beyond the adaptation plan, we've got these 3 critical initiatives of climate, Civilian Climate Corps, America the Beautiful, and Justice 40. And then the EO also is mandating ultimately the creation of a Forest Service climate adaptation plan, which I'll talk about in a minute. Let's talk about the forestry strategy. To dig into that, the CSAF, Climate Smart Ag and Forestry. There are 7 of these strategies listed in this 90-day progress report. The first is to actually quantify and track what we're doing. That seems like a no-brainer, but it's mostly not done. And so investment into that. Developing strategies that work across the ag and forestry sectors and for all people who engage with those sectors. And that gets back into these critical issues of environmental and climate justice. And then leveraging existing USDA programs, tweaking them, making them work better to support adaptation and not trying to recreate the wheel right and left. Education and technical assistance is a core part of doing that so that we can rely upon the creativity of our workforces and our public and instead of just trying to make stuff up by a few elites, so-called elites, I would say. And then there's the idea of supporting new and better markets for forestry products, and I just covered that. The more that we can have a thriving set of forest industries that are engaging with our forests, I think the better off we are in adaptation. And then finally, well, not finally, on number 6, there's this develop a forest and wildfire resilience strategy. I'm going to dig into that one in a moment and improve research. Okay. So forest and wildfire resilience. You see in that first one, increase the rate of fuels reduction, decrease risk of severe wildfire over the next actually 19 years. Don't ask why. But in the newly released Wildfire Crisis Strategy document, they're looking at increasing the pace and scale of our fuels reduction and forest health improvements over an additional 20 million acres on NFS lands in the next 10 years and 30 million acres on other lands. This is made possible, of course, with the additional investments through the bipartisan infrastructure law. This is a massive increase in funding, a massive increase in the pace and scale of what we're looking at doing. It really, really is going to drive, I think, some paradigm shifts in the Forest Service. Likewise, in People in Forest Climate Working Group, we'll get this instantly as well. There's this increase in the needed rate of reforestation. Covered both of these things in the past slides. That increase in the rate of reforestation pushes all the way back the reforestation supply chain to also increase nursery capacity and then forward through time to understand that we need to be using climate adapted species and climate informed practices so that our investments now pay off over the long term and don't end up with, say, another wildfire crisis later on. Likewise, we need to be applying all of these efforts and investments in a way that is equitable and engages more than perhaps just the traditional communities as we think of them. So stepping back a little bit, those top 5 components there, those top 5 components of the 14008, they should all be reflected in the 6th, which is the Forest Service Climate Adaptation Plan. Yeah, no pressure, I'm the lead of that plan. So stepping back again, in these next 4 bullets, I've just got 1 slide apiece, so we're not going to be here all day, but I'm going to go through these a little bit more quickly. So agency-wide assessments. We have all kinds of investment, people, programs, databases, reporting associated with the various assessments and inventories and analyses that you see listed here. They have varying degrees of climate awareness and explicit climate inclusion. These are all about understanding the status, trends, and vulnerabilities of our ecosystems, and therefore informing our investments as we go forward into managing these ecosystems. So a big priority is ensuring that all of these are inclusive of climate change and are climate informed, so that the actions that they inform are themselves then climate informed. Likewise, investment into the USDA climate hubs and threat centers, and I'll say some other core partnerships like NIACS and adaptation partners that also contribute to these same activities. That is, when I talk to people out in the field, I get less resistance to engaging in climate adaptation, and I get just frankly more exhaustion and a sense of overwhelm. But what folks are requesting is just help getting this work done. That's what these organizations do through their applied climate services and their information and guidance on carbon stewardship. And then agency-wide actions. One thing about the breadth of Forest Service activities, lands, and especially partnerships is that you can find a beautiful example somewhere of virtually everything that we need to be doing everywhere. So an enormous priority is finding and scaling up and ultimately mainstreaming these successful pilots, these approaches, these activities, so that we can be more effectively in all places. Again, understanding that caveat of the place matters, and not all places are the same, and the people who are interacting with places have different values. Now, then we've got this little one on the last bullet there of hazardous fuels treatments. I'm going to come back to that. So we've got then the Forest Service Climate Change Roadmap, Scorecards, and Plan. My guess is that we have on the phone or the line here somewhere the venerable Dave Cleaves, and by venerable Dave, I don't just mean old. Now, Dave was, of course, instrumental as a former climate advisor of creating the National Roadmap for Responding to Climate Change. That is a robust document. I still look at that, and it still provides the guideposts for where we are and where we are going today. It generated the Climate Change Performance Scorecard originally, which helped track our climate change activities. And then there were various versions of that scorecard through time. So now we're looking at creating this Forest Service Climate Adaptation Plan, which will explicitly identify our intent at a broad strategic level for climate change, as well as the challenges to following through with our programmatic goals and our mission. Likewise, the climate action tracker that we're building right now and will release this year, that will be more quantitative than it's ever been, designed to increasingly link with our corporate databases and work streams, so that rather than an extra effort that people have to do to fill this thing in, it becomes just a part of what they do. And likewise, more and more, the great climate-related activities that people are engaging in are better reflected. Okay, wildfire. So I don't think I have to inform Forest Climate Working Group folks on this call about the depth of the wildfire crisis. You all understand because you all helped create the conditions which have generated sort of relief for the Forest Service and other agencies to address the crisis. So in that sense, you know, that last bullet of partnership being foundational to success, the partnership started before we got the funding to engage in the wildfire crisis strategy. But likewise, without continuing and deepening active partnerships, I don't think that well, I know for a fact we won't be successful. Now, if we bring this back to climate change here, let's get back to that very first slide. We know of the various linkages between all kinds of threats, past management, climate, leading to fire as sort of that last exclamation point on ecosystem decline. As we're thinking about fire suppression, we're really looking at a resistance activity in terms of thinking about climate. And so as we look at that resistance, we're seeing the need for ever increased investment to be effective in the resistance. And we know and have seen that risk is increasing, and this will only get worse. And then we see what system failure looks like in some of these really devastating catastrophic fires out west. So how do we increase the resilience of these systems? That is where this strategy comes in. So just to be clear, this crisis strategy, it really is a core component of our climate adaptation priorities, both in addressing the immediate crisis, but also setting up these ecosystems for longer term management and adaptation. Okay, last slide here. So this first bullet looks simple, right? But it's really hard when we consider the complexity of this wicked problem, climate change. How do we act intentionally? Even if we know what we think we need to do, even when we know what to do, to the extent that it deviates from business as usual, from traditional practices, it's hard to communicate that. It's hard to avoid dropping into the very human tendency towards doublespeak when a hard conversation is needed, and instead using, you know, these comfort words. Really, there are some hard choices that we have in front of us, and we need to be discussing those frankly. That gets to that second bullet. Not all of our climate change informed choices are ideal, and in fact, really our viable choices may feel like mission failure. And our non-viable choices may be the only ones we're allowed to choose, and they may in fact end in mission failure in some places. This again, how do we even discuss this? And that gets back to that first bullet. Let's have some frank discussion and planning about this so it doesn't come as a shock to people. We should be thinking about this. That third bullet, I'm just going to be blunt here. The Forest Service is not a carbon agency. We need to continue to focus on ecological integrity, and we need to balance multiple benefits for both our current American public, but also future generations. So it hurts me to say this a little bit because, you know, carbon scientist here, but we need to manage for ecosystem integrity, understanding that carbon is an important, even critical component of what we do, but it's not the single thing that we do. And then again, look at the first two bullets. So finally, the thing that I want to say about capacity and partnership is that we can't do this work on our own. If we try, we'll fail. Heck, we can't even spend the increases in funding we're getting on our own and get the work done in the time we've allotted to do it. This requires deep discussion and partnership and activity, and that gets back to my first slides about the variety of values and risk tolerance and perception that we have across the country. So we're going to roll things out across the country, but things happen locally, and we need to be partnered with people at all levels of planning and action if we're going to get this work done and do it in a climate-informed manner. All right, I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
It was great. Thank you so much, Chris. That was really, really wonderful. It was great to see some familiar slides from your previous work, and really appreciated the overview of where USDA is at now. I'm going to ask my team member too to please put the pin on me as well if you can, because I cannot see all of my options where I'm at. But yeah, so let's jump into a couple of questions. Again, this was really great. We have some really nice questions kind of rolling in here, so we might be scrambling to keep them organized here in the back. But to kind of get you started, we wanted to ask a couple clarifying questions here. One is, do the climate assessments and plans include all land ownerships? You showed a map with a lot of very diverse actors on the landscape. Do those assessments include all ownerships? And this person also had an example. Do those service plans, for example, maybe in the lake states, if they're not already including those other ownerships, could they be reasonably referenced or adapted for other ownerships in the same region? How would you recommend we think about those tools?
Great question. I showed a bunch of tools and a bunch of types of assessments, and they vary. And so, for example, the watershed framework, that is particularly for the Forest Service, although some watersheds could be shared with other ownerships. And so in many places, there will be watershed partnerships, and they may be participating jointly in those. The forest inventory and analysis, of course, that is a national effort and does cover all of the forests, and the RPA, the resource protection assessment, that also covers the entire United States. Likewise, there are many regional assessments, climate vulnerability assessments that have been done, or sub-regional assessments that have been done by partnerships, again, like the Adaptation Partners and NIACS, that don't just cover federal lands, but also cover many other lands. So, boy, yeah, so much stuff out there that I have a hard time getting to that last part of the question about how to connect them. And I would say, just look at where you are, and best thing to do, reach out to your local hub, for example, USDA Climate Hub, and ask exactly that question. And then they can link you with all the stuff that you're supposed that you want to be linked with, because literally that's their jobs.
That's great. That was actually another question we had, was the role of the hubs. So actually, to stay on that, that's great. Can you elaborate a little more on who is what's the main audience of the climate hubs, and like, who are they primarily? Who's their primary audience? What should we look for them for? We have very diverse folks here. I'm just skimming through the names. Could you just, from your perspective, what's the best way to think about the hubs and who they're really targeting?
The hubs have a couple of primary goals, and internally we'll refer to those as in-reach and outreach. The hubs are designed in terms of in-reach to provide critical training and technical assistance to USDA agencies, and that is that idea of, hey, let's get our workforce across USDA trained up as fast as we can, so that they're applying their day-to-day creativity and energy into things that are climate informed. And that includes providing technical assistance to any number of non-federal entities and people. The outreach then is also just helping whoever's out there. And so some hubs have more capacity than others, but all of them exist to essentially provide that education and technical assistance. And so I would say, reach out and see what they're up for. And if they can't do something themselves, they will generally know all the folks who are doing these things and can connect you.
Yeah, thanks for that. So you mentioned not being that obviously with the climate change, we have a big emphasis on carbon. That's happening in many spaces. But that you highlighted, we still have a lot of diverse values for forests, and that within USDA and the Forest Service, there's a commitment to maintaining a wide variety of values. With that in mind, are there examples of programs that have had an increasing linkage to carbon storage, or where carbon is becoming a factor in decision-making or prioritizing? So for example, the Forest Legacy Program, could that be thought of as like a carbon capture and mitigation strategy? So kind of exploring how is that carbon piece, recognizing it's not dominant, but are there some specific activities that are kind of seen as part of a climate strategy?
Yeah, great question. There's again, a carbon component in this, and then a climate adaptation component in this. And there's active discussion right now about that second one, the adaptation component, in all of our Forest Service programs. And so how do we write into program guidance, into requests for proposals, into planning activities, and awarding activities, review activities? How do we integrate climate change at all of those levels? How do we do that as fast, but also as responsibly as possible, to not just break the system? And so, and where is it appropriate? Where is it needed? What is the reference like? What is a reasonable burden, and how soon? Those are all discussions. And so that's going across really all of the big programs right now. And then carbon, right? So carbon is an aspect of that. Carbon could be considered a management. Carbon sequestration or uptake or increased storage could be considered a management objective. And so I would say that within Forest Service, National Forest System lands, it's something that will be considered, but also, again, managed in balance with other multiple benefits or multiple uses. And so if the goal is to preserve Kirtland's warbler that requires an early seral stage forest, we're not going to be looking at carbon as a primary management goal in that forest. So an old growth forest or mature forest that is already largely removed from harvesting, right? So that makes a lot of sense to pursue carbon as one of its primary objectives. So there's balance that goes on across lands.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, so I'll circle back around to that in just a minute. We have a couple of questions about how the funding opportunities that have been coming from USDA are reflecting the objectives that you covered today. So one observation was it seemed like some of the funding opportunities so far have been towards more ag oriented. And so wondering what your thoughts were on that, and if you had a sense of if there would be some, if that is actually your observation, or if there's more opportunities coming for forestry.
Well, you probably, and this might be an academic, a person from university, also referring to NIFA opportunities. I would never say that my friends in NIFA give short shrift to forestry activities. It's absolutely never say that in public. So I do encourage them all the time to, devote more of their funding opportunities to forestry activities. How is that?
That's good. So we'll keep an eye on things as they come out. Another one that was kind of related to these types of initiatives and funding opportunities was just your thoughts on supporting new and innovative partnerships, including like public-private tribal partnerships to advance forestry. So what are you seeing as like opportunities there, whether there's like actual initiatives and funding opportunities, or where there are gaps, you know, from your outlook, probably even more generally speaking of what you see as needing to happen and bridging some of those actors?
I think there's going to be tremendous opportunities coming over the next few years, and maybe more than has ever existed before. And I think hopefully I got that across in my remarks in the talk. We have this influx of funding, and the Forest Service has been in this era of scarcity for so long that we literally don't have the capacity to spend the money, certainly not internally. And but we can't spend the money to even do the hiring to get the work done, right? So this work can't get done without non-Forest Service people being a part of it, which is to say partnerships are integral to getting virtually all of the work that I described done. And so so within the Forest Service, there are ideas and creativity coming out about, hey, what does that look like, and who can we partner with, and what can we do, and do they embed people with us? Do we embed people with them? Do we fund positions in local communities? Do we fund tribes? How does this, right? So there's all that, but frankly, I would look forward, and I'm sure the rest of the Forest Service would, to your creativity. What partnerships do you have ready-made that can get work done? And then come to the folks who are working in the places, the Forest Service folks working in those places, and start talking to them, start prepping it, priming it. Especially, with tribes, there's a lot of interest in the Forest Service right now in figuring out how to make the Tribal Forest Protection Act work, so that tribes can jointly design management projects on Forest Service lands, with taking the lead, but with national forests, and do so in ways that are consistent with their perspectives and traditions. And so, who they also invite into that partnership is their choice.
Yeah, thank you for that. One other question here, before we get to maybe kind of this last bigger question, and we have some really great questions, so I'm very appreciative for everyone.
And I'm going on for a long time. I'll try to be more brief in my responses.
Oh, it's great. It's helpful. And maybe a couple kind of quick questions. Let's see here. One that has come up a few times is capacity for some of these types of maybe like restoration type efforts and reforestation. And what I know that nursery supplies and saplings is a concern in some areas. Is that something that you're linking? It's on your radar, or thoughts about that in terms of some of the scale of the efforts that need to happen in upcoming years?
Yeah, it's a concern. Is that I talked about the Forest Service having, struggling with having been in this sort of era of low capacity. Well, a lot of the forest sector has been experiencing it, and there are places where there's just not, there might be great ideas. Hey, let's go in and do a bunch of fuels treatments. There just might not be the workforce to do it. There might not be any place to send anything we might remove from those forests to make them more resilient to fire, for example, wildfire. So, that's why it's a 10-year strategy also. And a big part of that strategy, there's not an expectation that we're going to hit the ground sprinting. There is very much an expectation of priming the pumps and getting things, I know I'm mixing my metaphors, I just can't help it, getting things going gradually and building up the capacity that we need to build up so that, you know, in the latter years, we really are sprinting.
Yeah. And could we just also touch on this idea? We have a couple of questions here aligned with like ecosystem connectivity and the role of various adaptation strategies and as in restoration or connecting habitats, and what does assisted migration look like in those strategies? Could you just talk a little bit about how you are viewing that? I mean, for example, in Michigan, where we have a lot of like ag land below us, and I know there's some concern that there's not sufficient connectivity. How do you think about either increasing or returning some of that connectivity as a strategy compared to other areas, which is more like protecting or improving resilience of areas that are currently and still forested?
Well, I don't think of it as a versus at all. It's more like we need to be doing all of this, and in some cases the actors involved are just going to be really different, and the scale that we're thinking at is certainly going to be different, which means that, you know, the partnerships, the agreements, the planning, that all differs, and it's much different set of choices and actions and people on a 200 or 10,000 hectare plot of land versus working across multiple agencies and tribes and state ownerships to connect an entire corridor for migration, for example. We have the ability to do all of that at once, right? We just need to get more people involved in thinking about it, have those discussions more explicitly and frequently and openly, make this a better and more help our public to be better informed about these discussions as well, and to understand some of the risks that we are all thinking about. Because I guess my impression is that a lot of the public doesn't get the risk that we're looking at, and that's in part because those conversations are really hard to have, and it's pretty easy to just go on to something easier to discuss.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that insight. And as you kind of alluded to, there's a lot of additional decision makers that need to be involved. And so there's a big kind of learning curve there of even what the solutions are and how to actually go about them. And so maybe a final question, as we do have kind of this higher level question, then kind of jumping off of that. You obviously have pretty heavy lift, and we are facing this, really huge existential challenge. But what are you optimistic about? And can you give us some insight on where do you see the best places for us to be forming those types of dialogues and bringing in some of those different actors? Where do you see solutions in crossing some of those barriers?
I am very optimistic, more than I've ever been, frankly. And what passed in the bipartisan infrastructure law and what was written into the Build Back Better, even though that hasn't passed, what got in there, it gives me tremendous grounds to be optimistic. There's more attention to the issues that we've all been grappling with in the forest sector. There's more attention more broadly in society to those issues than I think there's been in a generation or more, maybe ever, I don't know. And so where do we connect? It's kind of like that last question. We connect at all levels. And so, that includes getting connected to the local district office of your national forest, or writing to somebody in the regional headquarters or the national office and saying, I have an idea, I would like to be a part of this opportunity. It could be linking in through some of the proposals. It could be just engaging with state and private and the coordinators in state and private to link in with the many opportunities that they provide. Boy, I don't know. I'm kind of just talking around myself because there's so much to do and so many places that it can get done, that really the creativity is the only thing that could hold us back, or could just bust us forward and let us loose.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for those kind of closing thoughts. I think they're much appreciated by a lot of folks here. And we do have some kind of nice comments down here of some specifics of where different folks are working. So they're really representing everything from kind of local level NGOs, policymakers, people in different agencies at different levels, private sector actors. So, I do think that it's a really great way to wrap up, especially with this group as part of the Forest Climate Working Group that's all helping to bring, one subset of those actors together. And yeah, so just really appreciate your time today and all the great insight and work that you've been doing for many years in this space. It's certainly made a big impact and gives us a lot to work with. So thanks so much for taking the time to prepare your talk and share that with us today.
Thank you, Lauren. Thanks for having me. Thanks everybody for being here.
Yes, and so just to kind of wrap up quickly, everybody, we will make the recording available on our website. And also, again, reminder to feel free to sign up for our next session that we'll be having in just about a month if you haven't already signed up. So thanks everyone for the time today. I hope you all have a great rest of the afternoon. And if in a snowy area like I am, enjoy the snow. And thanks again, Chris. It was great to see you. Bye-bye, everybody.